Hi, everybody. I'm really excited today because I'm here with Dr. David Falk, and this has been a little while in coming. I've been trying to get his attention on his channel for a while to see if he'd come on my channel because I've been watching a lot of his videos. And so he is an Egyptologist. He has a Ph.D. from the University of Liverpool in Egyptology, and he's also has 3 master's degrees. So that already is far in advance of my own. I have 1 master's degree. He has 3. And so his degrees are in things such as the Near Eastern, biblical archaeology, and languages. And so he's a complete expert in all of the topics that we're going to discuss today. And so without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Falk. And maybe, Dr. Falk, if you could share with us, I know you're a Christian, so maybe if you could share with us a little on how you came to Christianity, how you came to your beliefs.
Well, I grew up in a Christian home, essentially. It's not much more illustrious than that. I mean, I went through the typical crises of faith that everyone has to go through, challenging my assumptions in Christianity and growing in the process. So it wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a slow development process over time.
Yeah, I think that's kind of similar to my own ways. It's like you become a Christian, you're born into the Christian faith, but then we all do question it. We say, are we just in this fallback, or do we have good reasons for our beliefs? And so when you went to study, now I'm thinking of you and Dr. Josh Digital Hammurabi, because he went off to college with this idea that he was going to get into the lion's den and convert people. And his academics actually turned his mind away from Christianity and toward, in his studies of Assyriology. So I'm wondering, has your studies of Egyptology, have those made it very difficult to be a Christian, or have you found that the archaeology, languages, things like that line up with Christianity and biblical beliefs?
Well, I think one of the differences between, say, Josh and myself is upbringing, really. While we were both raised in, say, Christian homes, I was not raised in a rigid Christian home. My parents are actually much more on the liberal side of Christianity than they are on the conservative side, even though they've spent most of their lives in, say, conservative churches. So I was never really told what to believe. I was more or less exposed to belief. So under those circumstances, you have sort of the freedom to test ideas, and various interpretations of the Bible were welcome in my home growing up. So under those circumstances, when I did go off to college and started having challenges to my faith, it was more along the lines of, okay, yeah, it's a challenge to the faith, but is there an answer to the challenge? Am I reading the text right? So for me, and frankly too, I didn't do my graduate work until fairly late in life. I went back to grad school when I was 35. So I had an undergrad degree in philosophy that I pursued right after coming out of high school. Graduated, and then I worked as a computer systems analyst for 15 years. And then I went back at age 35, got into horrendous amounts of student debt, and here I am.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I think that's also kind of similar to me. My parents definitely lean to the left in politics, actually, and in Christianity. So I think I was never forced to do really anything. The belief was shown to me, and I decided to accept it. And so I can completely relate to you in that area as well. But let me ask you this. One of the things that the scholars have been hammering away at, and not to use the word Hammurabi, I know I picked on that a little bit, but one thing that scholars have been hammering away at since around the 1700s, 1800s is the Bible, and they're trying to say that it's not legitimate, it's not authoritative, it wasn't written by the original authors that the traditions have said it was written by. And so I'm wondering if, as an Egyptologist and somebody who's very familiar with the culture that was in existence around the time of Moses, I'm wondering, do you find the evidence that we have either archaeologically or in language or in the Bible or outside of the Bible consistent with the idea that there was a Moses, an historic person who led people out of Egypt and into the Promised Land? And I know a little bit on what you think about this, but I want the audience to know too.
Okay. Well, we almost kind of have to approach this from looking at, is the evidence consistent with an Exodus? Because we don't have any written records of Moses. What we see is, a mid 19th dynasty context. And that context is consistent with what we find in the biblical narrative. Now, given that the context is consistent, that there is a big city, Avaris, that's abandoned mid-Dynasty 19, that happens to be right next door to the capital of Egypt, and that city is populated by Asiatic Semites, yeah, we've got some evidence here that say that it is consistent with what's told in the biblical narrative. Now then, having all that, having the consistency of evidence, and we're talking here about both external and internal evidence, the external archaeological evidence, the textual evidence, the toponymic evidence, but we also have to say the internal evidence that we find a whole lot of Egypt in the Torah. A whole lot of Egypt's in there. Even if we don't find the Israelites in Egypt, we find Egypt in the Israelites. A whole lot of it. And it's a really hard thing to try to make consistent with, say, more radical views on this. So then it comes to the Moses question. To quote Kenneth Kitchen here, if Moses didn't exist, you'd have to make him up, essentially. Because when you look at, say, protest movements during the Ramesside period, and there were some, we do have labor unrest during the Ramesside period. We do have attempts to find redress. In almost every one of these cases, there's a Moses-like figure involved. Like, for example, during the labor strikes that hit late Dynasty 20, there is actually a sort of this outsider, a Magi, who leads the protesters. And he's almost like a Moses-like figure. He has standing before the mayor of Thebes, but at the same time, too, he's trusted by his community of Egyptian workers. So you do find these figures extant in the protest movements of the 19th dynasty. So you'd almost have to, if Moses didn't exist, you'd almost have to create one. So this isn't mythology by any stretch of the imagination. At the very least, it's hagiography, which is the study of saints. We'll recognize with most of the stories of saints, there's a real person underneath all the reception history involved.
That's great. That is very interesting. And I'm just wondering, so I wanted to get into this a little bit on where you date Moses, because you're dating, there's dating varies a little bit depending on people's interpretations of different passages in the text. And so I wanted to see if you wanted to talk about that. Your dating, actually, I just found out today, is consistent with rabbinic Jewish dating, from my understanding.
It is,
I believe.
It is.
So yeah, can you share with us that?
It dates to 1265 roughly. There's some variance there, given variances in particular events, but roughly around 1265 BC. And that's around the 25th year of Ramses II.
Taking notes as you're saying this stuff, just to make sure I get my
so in the big context, in the big sort of context of the life of Ramses II, it's just after his final campaign in his 18th regnal year, and it's just as they're cementing the treaty with the Hittites.
Very interesting. And so you notice the Hittites are no longer with us, and there's a bunch of people who have a bunch of tribes and other groups that have disappeared from those times. What's your take on that? And I've been reading or listening a little bit on the Sea Peoples and how the Sea Peoples really devastated the Egyptians and other people in those ancient times right around there. What's your take on, if you knew about, I'm sure you know about the Sea Peoples, but where you think that, because I read that they might actually have come from way up north because of Icelandic volcanoes and other kinds of activities.
Oh, I think that's too far. That's sort of way too far. They're essentially Greeks. They're essentially Indo-Europeans. And they're first of all, they're moving into Western Anatolia, Turkey, modern day Turkey. And this is where we get the famous Trojan War. The famous Trojan War is these Greeks who are essentially colonizing Western Anatolia. And they come into conflict with Troy. And they're then moving down the coast of the Mediterranean until they finally hit Egypt itself. And this is, we see these conflicts with, say, Merneptah and Ramses III, with a great his great battle with the Sea Peoples. So they're moving down. It's kind of interesting. They're moving down and invading, say, the coastal plain of the Levant at the same time as the Israelites are coming in from the Jordan side into the Judean foothills. So in a sense, the two peoples, the Philistines and the Israelites, are splitting up Canaan between them. Because we have to remember that Israel is back before the 1940s was separated almost down the center by a swamp, a really difficult to pass swamp. That swamp is drained in the 1940s for agricultural land. But for most of Israel's history, it was divided by a swamp. Water would run off from the Judean foothills and collect in this swamp, and then you had this sort of section of land that was on the edge of the sea, between the sea and the swamp.
That is interesting. I didn't know that.
So the Philistines are occupying that coastal plain, but they also still need more food to feed their people. And this is where we get the agricultural wars in the Shephelah during the time of King Saul and King David. So that's when sort of the two cultures meet or clash. Is one side, the Philistines are building their cities on the western side of the Shephelah Valley, and the Israelites are building their cities on the eastern side of the Shephelah, and then they're fighting in between and growing crops and having their little agricultural war.
That's fascinating. That brings us to another question that I just wanted to say, going back into this idea where Egypt is all through the Torah, you said, and it reminds me of one of your videos, because you mentioned that the language of the Torah has some sort of Egyptian clues that would give away the author in being around the time of Moses. so you would know that.
We have toponyms that are very, very, like, toponym is just a fancy word for place name. Place names that are very, very specific to the time of Ramses II. Pithom is the capital city of the Wadi Tumilat. And in the Wadi there's this city that gets, the fortifications are rebuilt, and a temple of Atum is built by Ramses II. And that city is christened Pithom, Per Atum Chaku. Pithom comes from Per Atum or Pitum. So that name originates with Ramses II. The city of the fortress of Migdol on the coast was first constructed by Seti I, the father of Ramses II. And the city, the fortress of Migdol, is also in the Exodus account. We also find in Egyptian documents the Pihahirot, Balsafan. All these are 19th dynasty documents, such as the Anastasi papyri, the Salier papyri. We also find, for example, where they're actually starting the Exodus from, the city of Ramses. Well, that's in Egyptian text. This is Per-Ramses, or P-Ramses, House of Ramses. This was the capital city that was first constructed by Ramses II. Before then, there's actually no city underneath there. It's actually located on an island. Prior to Ramses II, all that had been there was a royal residence built by his father, Seti I. So all these place names peg it into that 19th dynasty context. Now we have lots of other things too that sort of show that this is 19th originates from the 19th dynasty. There's some vocabulary too that changes over time, and that transition is sort of snapshot caught at just the right point in time. Like there's one particular word that changes its form after 1200 BC, and we find the earlier form preserved in the Pentateuch, but the later form isn't there. So is lots of stuff like that.
Yeah. Is the later form, now let me ask you this, because I've been digging into Isaiah a lot lately, and I've also been, previous to that, I've been digging into Daniel. And my belief is that Isaiah was written by Isaiah around the 8th century BC.
Go figure.
And Daniel was written by Daniel around the 6th century BC. And so there's these—
Go figure again.
But you, with the knowledge of language, what would you, if you looked at something like Isaiah and compared it to the Torah, or you looked at Daniel and compared it to the Torah, or even stuff that came out later in maybe even the New Testament or something? I know that's in Greek, but still, I'm wondering how do you think about that? Do you think that the language points to these texts coming more as the tradition had determined?
Well, I'm not that familiar with the language components of those texts. All right, my focus has really been on Pentateuchal studies. Okay, so that's really much more of in my wheelhouse. But I have not so far found a really compelling reason to late date those other texts. Nothing that's convinced me.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so going back to dating Moses and this whole idea, now there's a hypothesis that they came out with, Wellhausen's hypothesis, or the documentary hypothesis. And it's this idea that maybe Moses could have written a little bit, but perhaps a lot of other authors are involved, and they had all of these different intentions, and they wrote it over centuries, and some as late as the 8th century BC or the 7th century BC. And it just coincidentally always seems to be in alignment with when some of the prophecies in these books were fulfilled. Suddenly the dating comes to the same time of the prophecy. And so there was, of course, Moses had mentioned in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, he'd kind of spoken of something that sounded like the exiles that occurred right around the northern kingdom being exiled in the 8th century BC, and of course the southern kingdom being exiled later. And so I'm just wondering if you have looked at any of those hypotheses that Moses was written over a whole bunch of different authors. And
I've no, I don't. I also think too that evangelicals a little overblow this too. Okay. When we talk about the documentary hypothesis, we are talking the idea that the Pentateuch was created gradually over time, starting at around 950 BC with the J source. Now, when we talk about the documentary hypothesis, we have to be really careful here, because there's terminology here that's used in ways that other, say, scholars wouldn't use it. Okay, like when I talk about a source, I talk about a written document, a document that is physical, it's in hand, it's something that's real and tangible. When they talk about a source, they're talking a hypothetical oral document that doesn't really exist. Okay? When I talk about an editor, I talk about somebody who is stringing together texts and creating an edited edition. When they talk about editing, they talk about going back into the text and changing it, which is where we get the redactors come in. Sort of the magic wand that fixes all the problems with the documentary hypothesis. So they sort of use it in that way. Now, for modern evangelicals, this is going to be a challenge to it's going to be a challenge to a lot of the ways that we teach certain doctrines in the church. Like, for example, there's basically three sort of areas where this comes in contact with people's faith. First, when Jesus ascribes the law to Moses, and a lot of evangelicals will overread that and say, well, the whole law must have been written by Moses. And that's an overreading. That's an overreading of that text. And frankly, even if the documentary hypothesis were correct here, and there's an oral Torah that was given by Moses, then Jesus' words are still correct, because he's ascribing it to Moses, even if it's just an oral law, as per the documentary hypothesis. Mm-hmm. So that's one area. Another area that sort of Christians run afoul of is the doctrine of inspiration. The idea that if redactors are coming along and changing the text, then it can't be inspired, because and there's a little bit of truth to this, but it's also, well, even if it was, say, edited orally or redacted, were the redactors themselves inspired? Because the whole idea of inspiration isn't that God is downloading words into the prophet's brain to write. It's the idea that God has equipped the prophet for the task of writing the scriptures. Inspiration is more than just God, zapping the prophet with an idea. It's his upbringing, it's his education, it's his reading, it's his life experiences, all of that. It's the doctrine of inspiration is really an extension of the doctrine of providence. And we have to take inspiration on that level, that is actually an extension of providence, where people are supernaturally, and I use the word supernaturally as in directed, in their life circumstances to prepare them for writing scripture with their own words. And this will apply to, say, editors that compile sources. This will apply to people who add, the epilogue to the Torah, which talks about the death of Moses. We don't know who wrote that, but it wasn't Moses himself. He wasn't writing about his own death. That's added on after by another. But that person is as equally as inspired as Moses himself. So even in this case, even if the documentary hypothesis were correct, it doesn't so much matter. The final sort of challenge that we see to evangelicals is actually when, say, the documentary hypothesis is overread, where that oral law basically gets sort of transformed into, oh, well, other people just wrote it. It wasn't Moses at all. And then there's a denial of Moses himself. And I think that's probably the most problematic aspect of, say, the documentary hypothesis, is the denial of Moses himself as a person, or a denial of the Exodus itself. So I think in those particular cases, that's where we sort of have to say, give a little bit of pushback and go, hey, you know what? Does the evidence that we have, is it consistent with the documentary hypothesis, or is it something that needs a more critical eye?
Yeah, good. And I did want to point out that the words that were used by Paul and by Jesus, they said Moses wrote of me, and Moses writes. But I agree with you. Moses couldn't have written about his own death, so we have to realize that someone else was involved here. And so,
well, we have to understand that the Torah is written over a 40-year period. It's written over a 40-year period, and they're not just Moses isn't just or his amanuensis. I mean, he's possibly could have used scribes too, and just dictated it. He's not just sort of one day wakes up in the morning and writes all of the book of Exodus, or wakes up one morning and writes all the book of Deuteronomy.
Yeah,
these things are written short document after short document in the day roll kind of fashion, as they're moving from camp to camp. So at the end of Moses' life, what does he have? He has a collection of papers. He has a collection of papers that somebody then has to string together.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And they read
It's
in
an
the
archive.
scrolls and yeah.
And this is what we have to say that what we have with the Torah is an archive. It's 5 books, but each book is an archive. Now, if one thinks about what is the consequences of this, we don't then have one source for the Exodus. We have many sources for the Exodus.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing that I just want to say is we don't just have. It would be if you believe and if they believed, of course, that this is Holy Scripture. This is God's words, breathed through Moses, or this is just the message of God that's spoken through the prophets, or God ordained these prophets to be able to write this down, or whatever it is. It's the idea that there wouldn't just be a single copy. Right. So wouldn't it make sense to believe that once this is written down, people start the scribal schools of just duplicating it because they want to make sure if they get destroyed, it doesn't disappear. So,
well, like for example, people will recount the same event over and over again, even in their own personal writings, in their journals, because some events are just so traumatic or pivotal in their lives that they do this. Ramses II has 7 accounts of his battle of Kadesh. Each one is slightly different in how it's written. So when we see, for example, the Exodus recounted in Exodus 12, and then recounted in a different way in Numbers chapter 33, well, we got to say, okay, is there some possibility here that it's the same author recounting it in 2 different ways? And people back then, I think one of the problems I have with the documentary hypothesis, besides its underlying lack of evidence, is the fact that it diminishes the virtuosity of the author. Like, for example, the documentary hypothesis has had a lot of different criteria used to try to determine which source is which. And because so many different criteria are used by so many different people, there's no universal agreement across the board. I mean, you could look at, say, guys like Driver, who else? Martin Noth, Friedman, Baden, and each of these 4 men, for example, just to take an example, how they break down the source documents for the plagues, for the 10 plagues. And they all come up with different conclusions because they're all using different criteria. For example, one will say, oh, we see a change in persons, like the author will go from first person to third person. Yet we find documents in the ancient Near East that do this. So one of the things I think that's like for example, with the plagues, there's 3 different words used for how Pharaoh hardened his heart. We've got one that says he strengthened his heart. We have one that says he heart is made hard. We have another choice used where it's made heavy. And scholars who support the documentary hypothesis will say, aha, we got a change in verb. So we got a change in source, J versus E source. And what I find so terrible about this is it strips the original author of his virtuosity. Nobody uses the same word all the time in every instance.
Exactly. Exactly. And we change verb tenses too, surprise, surprise.
It's variation by difference. Or it's repetition through variation. That's what it is, variation through repetition. It's a literary device. Every young novelist, what is the... Oh, I'm using the word said so often. Let me whip out my thesaurus here and start looking up synonyms. Oh, he uttered this word. He muttered this word. He mumbled under his breath this word. This is the virtuosity of authorship. And it impoverishes the text to say every time there's sort of a literary change, it's a different author. It strips. It's like someone who's tone deaf instantly becoming a music critic. It just isn't going to work because you're not appreciating that the changes are where the virtuosity is.
I like that. Yeah, no, that's good. That's. I want to say thank you to Taking Back Eden. That's John. He's got a generous super chat. Says he challenges everyone here to memorize the 10 Commandments in order. I would have to get my notes out because
it's the most embarrassing question I ask. Say if I teach Sunday school on say the Torah or a class, one of the pop quiz. It's always a pop quiz. List all the 10 Commandments in order from memory. You don't have to get them out exactly perfect, but you got to get them in order, and you got to get them right.
Yeah.
Typical scores are pretty abysmal on this. It's like I'll often get scores out of 2 out of 10 and that sort of thing. It's just like,
oh, that's really bad. Well, I remember that they're a wider version of Jesus is saying love the Lord above all else and love your neighbors as yourself. But to get very specific, so you just kind of remember that the Lord comes first.
Everyone remembers the 2.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody remembers the 10.
So funny. Hey, I was also wondering, Dr. Falk, Susan asked me a question on talking about Joseph, talking about sort of the dating a little bit, going back to this idea that before Moses, of course, you had Joseph, one of the brothers of I think Joseph in the Technicolor coat or whatever, the dream coat.
Varicolored tunic. It's a varicolored tunic.
Oh,
varicolored tunic.
Varicolored tunic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when do you think he was around?
I believe he came to Egypt sometime after 1666 BC. So right during the reign of the Hyksos in the 15th dynasty. This is when we see the chariot start to be produced in Egypt and adapted for Egyptian conditions. So before then, we don't find the chariot in Egypt. We don't find it in warfare, and we got lots of warfare released from Beni Hassan. So that date to the Middle Kingdom. So Joseph arrives during the Second Intermediate Period. And he becomes vizier for the Hyksos, and his home territory is at the city of Avaris, which is the Hyksos capital.
It's interesting. And do we have archaeological evidence for Joseph? Anything that kind of points us to his existence?
No, we don't. But the problem is the Second Intermediate Period is so badly documented. We have almost there was an edition done by Ben Publications that did all the extant documents of the Second Intermediate Period, and it's about 50 pages long. We have 50 pages of documents from the entire Second Intermediate Period, and most of them are from Thebes. So all of them are outside of Avaris. We have no surviving texts from Avaris.
That's sad, actually. Maybe we'll hopefully.
And we don't have actually any of the viziers recorded for the Second Intermediate Period, neither from the Thebans nor from the Hyksos. So it's just an era with very, very poor preservation.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that's one thing we have to.
Oh, I was just going to say, what you're saying here too is going to coincide with what Stephen said in the book of Acts, that there was about 400 years or so in Egypt. That Abraham was told to be about 400 years in Egypt.
400 and Canaan. It's 430 years in Egypt and Canaan. Not just Egypt. Now, the Masoretic text only says Egypt. But when you look at, say, the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, it also includes Canaan in that. And that is consistent with the New Testament accounts. Because one of the things is when you look at, say, Exodus chapter 6, and the time frame of, say, the ancestors of Moses, you realize that the Israelites could not have been in Egypt more than 350 years. So you have to take into account those years in Canaan as well.
That's interesting. And so I like the fact that you do look at multiple, and you advise looking at multiple different interpretations or versions of the text, like saying the Septuagint, the Masoretic, because I've also noticed huge variations. I mean, what I would consider huge, like Isaiah 53:11, where it says he will see the light, versus the Masoretic version, he will just see. And I think that's a pretty big difference. But when you go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see he will see the light.
Yeah. I think one of the things that, say, to do this sort of work, one really has to have a good handle. I mean, you have to have a really excellent handle on the languages. I mean, you can't do this without the languages. And, you know, while I am primarily a historian, I'm also a language guy. I stress when I teach mastery of the languages. And frankly, you know, even if you're doing Old Testament work, you still need the Greek, because you're going to have to engage the Septuagint. I think one of the things that has been really helpful in my own work has been doing that lower text critical work, where I can take, say, the various text sources that are extant today, and then, say, compare those text sources to try to derive what probably would have been in the autographa, the autographs, the original writings.
Yeah, I like that. That's great. And so, you know, which languages do you know? So I know you want to share that, or is it more than? Obviously, it's more than two. You know, English, you know, and Greek and Hebrew.
Yeah, English is the one I'm least sure about.
That's impressive.
I've studied Greek, Hebrew, the various dialects of Egyptian, and there's 4 that I've mainly focused on: Middle Egyptian, Late Egyptian, Coptic, and Archaic Egyptian. I know a little bit of Hittite, a little bit of Ugaritic. I do Akkadian, a smattering of French, German, and Japanese.
Just for fun?
Japanese just for fun. I'm a big anime and manga fan, so for me, Japanese is all about fun.
Oh, that's neat. That's actually really neat. So the nice thing is that you can look at a text and you can probably get an idea of when and where it came from because of your knowledge of it's over time. You said different periods of time with respect to Egypt. Well,
you do encounter like all languages are living. They do change over time. And Hebrew is no exception to this. There's a early Hebrew, a middle Hebrew, and a late Hebrew as well. And then you start getting into medieval Hebrew and then those sort of sundry things to all the way to modern Hebrew. So it does change over time. So there are, say, features in, say, the writings and the prophets that definitely do have those characteristics of Middle Hebrew that may not be the same in, say, early Hebrew. Like, for example, the word suf, the famous Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds. Okay, in the Pentateuch, you encounter the word suf. Early Hebrew reads that, and that's a loan word from Egyptian, by the way. Comes from the Egyptian word tuf or tufi, meaning reeds. So that's a loan word from Egyptian, but in early Hebrew, it means reeds, and you see this in several passages of, say, the Pentateuch. Like, for example, when it's not only in the Sea of Reeds, but it's in the Exodus chapter 2, where Moses is placed in a basket, a teba, which is also an Egyptian loan word, which is made of suf reeds, and then it's floated among the suf reeds. So we see that.
I didn't realize that.
But later on in Middle Hebrew, suf takes on a completely different meaning. It takes on the meaning of sof, which means to end or the farthest extent. So we see that word change.
That's interesting. And that's good, because then it can help to date all of this stuff and bring us into the real picture of what's going on. So I really find that interesting. So I think that what else did I want to ask you about? I wanted to ask you, I have little notes here that I'm just trying to get through. So I wanted to ask you about as well, have you given any thought to the 10 plagues of the Exodus and with any?
I'm sorry.
Do we have any evidence of that outside of the Bible?
Okay, you cut out there for a moment, and I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. The 10 plagues in Exodus. Do we have any evidence outside of the Bible that these occurred?
Sure we do. Because first of all, the first 9 plagues are essentially amplifications of normal events that happen during the annual Nile inundation. The so-called, like for example, the water turning to blood. Now that's probably one of the most misunderstood plagues in the whole thing, because it's not the Nile turning red. Everyone in the ancient world understood that blood, when it's on the ground, is black. It's not red, because it oxidizes so quickly. So for ancient people, blood is this what the Hebrews would say is the difference between dam, the word for blood, and damot, the plural of blood. Lots of blood on the ground. That's blood. Damot is blood spilled on the ground. Dam is the blood that flows through your body. Everyone in the ancient world understood that blood on the ground is ooey gooey, oozy black, tar-like, ugh. Okay? So that's what they're thinking of. Now, they don't have a concept of crude oil back then. So when they're seeing the Nile turn this oozy, garbagey, black sludge, they're thinking blood. And we do find a reference to a very similar event that occurred during the First Intermediate period in some of the propaganda literature of Amenemhat the First. Like Prophecies of Nefertiti, for example, where it talks about the Nile turning to blood, and yet people drink it. So what this is it's an amplification of events that normally occur. Like in a normal Nile inundation, black silt is flushed down the Nile from Eastern Africa, the Nile Basin. And under a normal inundation, the river will go from kind of a murky green to this sort of ochreish brown color. But in really bad years of Nile inundation, it'll turn black. So what we're seeing here isn't a in these plagues isn't exactly. It's not a supernatural event. It's a hypernatural event. It's a natural event that's been amplified, made more serious. And that goes all the way along.
And I can say that because I saw something with locusts where there was over by Las Vegas, there was just an inundation of locusts. And so, and I heard that there were also some over in some other deserts. And so they come out like just by the millions and just ick.
Yeah.
So
I've seen an Egyptian locust. Yeah. They're not nice.
Yeah. So do we have, what about is there any records in Pharaoh Ramses or anything like that of his oldest son having died or because of that happening?
Yes, we do have records of now. In the case of Ramses II, we have to be clear that his first 12 sons died prior to the heir designate taking the throne, which was Merneptah. Okay, so Merneptah was 13th in line for the throne, and part of this is just that Ramses II lived so long. He lived into his late 90s.
Wow.
So he was on the throne for 66 years. So his firstborn son, we're lucky in that we know that the crown prince, Amenhotep Kopshef, was the heir designate, and he dies around the 25th year of Ramses II. So we're not exactly sure. We don't have a date for the death, but it's around the 25th year, because around the 25th year we see a new prince rise to the throne, to the crown prince, and of course he doesn't survive either. But ultimately the first 12 don't make it. But we have to also remember too that Ramses II had so many children. He had 120 sons and daughters. He had lots of treaty wives.
Wow.
Yeah, KV5, the tomb found in the Valley of the Kings, is the largest tomb there. Has roughly 120 chambers. corresponding to one of each of his sons and daughters. There's nothing quite like it in the Valley of the Kings. Yeah, it is very fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of those things with ancient times. All of these people took on multiple wives. I don't know how a man could handle that, more than one wife. We can be kind of pesky. So
you visit them once. Basically, the way the kings did it is they visited them once. They consecrated the marriage, the treaty marriage, and then they more or less ignored them for the next couple of years, next few years. That's usually how it worked.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry. My internet just jumped off for a second there and came back on, but I was able to make out what you said, so that part's good. So I'm also wondering, now you did a video, because one of the other things that is said in the Bible is 480 years. There's a 480-year timing. And you did a video that talked a little bit about symbolism and that sort of a thing. So I wanted to see if you could talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Now, the 480 years is not found in the Torah. It is found in, say, the book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings 6:1, and it talks about the 480th year after the departure of the Exodus. The temple of the Lord was constructed. Okay, Solomon starts the construction of the temple of the Lord. Now, what we have to understand is that when we look at, say, any text in the Bible, the first thing we try to do is ascertain the genre. What is the genre of the text? And in this particular case, what we have is a temple dedication inscription. How do we know this? Because we find a lot of them, essentially. And temple dedication inscriptions have certain features that make it distinct as a genre. They're short. They're relatively short inscriptions, which makes them actually kind of fun to read. But they tend to start with a... They situate their context in respect to an ancient event, an event that occurred in the distant past, and assign to it a certain number of years. Now, one of the interesting things that we find across the span of these temple dedication inscriptions is none of them are say, absolutely correct down to the year. They're all off. And it's something really, really strange that there's not an exact count of years here. But they all have, say, a numerological or an idiomatic significance. Now, for example, in the case of Tukulti-Ninurta I, it's a 720 years between Tukulti I and the founding of the Temple of Ishtar by Elishama. And in that case, it's 12 times 60. Now, 60 is the Mesopotamian number of magic number of this hexadecimal system of mathematics. 12 is a religiously significant number across the ancient Near East. Okay. We also have, for example, say the 400-year stela of Ramses I, Seti I, where it's reinaugurates the temple of Seth at Avaris and ascribes to a Hyksos king Nebti having been 400 years, 4th month, 4th day. Well, the Hyksos weren't reigning 400 years prior to that. They were reigning 350 years prior to that. So it's off by 350 years. But even so, Egyptian record keeping wasn't accurate down to the day like that. It just wasn't that accurate. So it's clear that they're emphasizing the fours as sort of a religiously significant number. 400, 4th month, 4th day. We get to, say, the Moabite stela, where King Mesha is talking about the house of Omri and how King Omri reigned 40 years. Well, he didn't reign 40 years. He reigned 12. We even find this in the Bible, where, say, 40 is used as, say, an idiomatic expression. It's an idiomatic expression that means just an extended long period of time. An uncertain but a long period of time. Like Moses. He's 40 years old when he leaves Egypt. He is a shepherd for 40 years, and after 40 years. He lifts his aged wife and two grown sons on a donkey. That poor donkey.
I know. It's so funny. Yeah, that's so true with the 40s, though. It's just like Jesus fasted for 40 days. Moses went into the
exactly.
for 40 years. He wandered around for 40 years. Very significant. And,
we find...
Yeah, I was just going to say, Jimmy Buffett, a pirate looks at 40.
I mean, we even find this in, say, in the book of Samuel, where, David reigns 40 years, but his son Absalom, kills his brother, runs away, comes back, and then after 40 years, he then approaches his father David. They both can't be being 40 in the same way, in the same sense.
Yeah, that
makes
a lot of sense. Sorry.
So when we look at a number like the 480th year, we have to ask, well, it's also a multiplication of two significant numbers, 12 and 40. One we know is a religiously potent number. The other one we know is an idiomatic expression.
Yeah.
And the Israelite writers were
writing fullness.
12 tribes, 12 apostles. Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't even just find this among, say, Israelites. We find this among, say, the Ishmaelites, who have 12 tribes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I heard that, I read somewhere, or I listened somewhere, it was talking about the ancient Near East being somewhat like that, where people were, numbers and years didn't necessarily mean they were chronological. It could be used symbolically and for other reasons in those times. And so I think that's consistent with what you're saying.
We've come back full circle to the whole idea of the virtuosity of the author. The virtuosity of the author uses language in multiple ways to achieve literary effects. So we've just come back full circle. Yeah.
Yeah, and that speaks to the unity of the book and how it kind of brings brings those books together in message. And so I think so. Do you think is the language, if you look at the 5 books, would it make any sense to say that now not breaking them out like JEDP, but also just breaking them down by the 5 books? Do they look different in language, or do they appear as if they're written by the same author, just looking at the ancient language as you do?
Well, I think it's one of those things where the language changes over those 40 years. There is a progression that we find in the language over those 40 years. That's very interesting. Because what they're doing is, when they're in the desert for 40 years, I mean, just take, for example, say, probably the best recorded language of a single individual that we have is Queen Elizabeth II. We have recordings of her from age 23 all the way now into her late 90s. Okay? So we have this huge sample of one person over one lifetime, and we can now look at her, look at how she speaks, and notice how radically her language has changed from a 23-year-old to a 90-year-old. It's really different. As a 23-year-old, she's talking very, very formal, prim, proper English. As a 90-year-old, it's almost like she came from Birmingham. She uses slang now. She never used slang in her 20s.
That's interesting.
Yeah. She'll say stuff that you go, if you had even like heard her in the 1960s, you'd go, wait, is this the same person? Wait, who's this gutter rat?
That's funny. Because I think about my own language and how I used to speak. When I was a teenager, I said a lot of likes, like, and I said a lot of things like awesome. Always everything was awesome, and there were all these little words that
awesome, dude, completely rad, man.
And then as I get older, I have to lose that, especially in the classroom. I'm not going to talk like that in the classroom. So, dude,
Totally rad.
Awesome. Yeah, totally.
I don't know when I use the word totally in that way in a conversation in the last decade, but
exactly. So you can see even our language and even words change. Like when I was young, the word gay meant happy. And so I have these little poems that I wrote when I was young about being happy and gay. And as I get older, I realize now it's taken on a new meaning. And so words just change a little bit too, even in our own lives.
So coming out of Egypt, the Israelites they're totally immersed in Egyptian culture. They're using Egyptian words. They're naming their children after Egyptian deities. As time progresses, they become and they're at this point, while they're wandering in the Sinai, they're not alone out there. They're not alone in the Sinai. There's Midianites out there. There's Bedouin out there. There's Shasu out there. They're encountering all these different Semitic groups out there. So their language is becoming more and more Semitic and less Egyptian the longer they wander out there, because they do have now new cultural exposures. We kind of have to remember that in the late Bronze Age, the Sinai was a savanna. It's not the same desert we have today. It went under a period of desertification. During the time of Moses, there were still almond trees, acacia trees growing in the Sinai. Today there aren't. There's grasslands out there. This is why the Midianites were pasturing their sheep in Sinai, because there was grasslands out there. Grasslands and springs and all that.
That's interesting.
So there were actually a fair number of people groups wandering the Sinai at the time. So they had this cultural engagement with other Semitic groups as they wandered out there. They traded for wine and sheep and all that stuff.
That's interesting too.
So they're not alone out there, even though they do they are not in their promised land yet. So their language is going to get more and more Semitic as they get closer and closer to their entry into Israel. So we would come to expect that there'd be some language change over time. And we even find this, say, in how the narrative is written, that there's even, like, for example, one of the things that sort of stuck out to me was, say, the name change for the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant isn't always called the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. It's originally called the Ark of the Testimony. And throughout the book of Exodus and most of, say, the book of Numbers, or I shouldn't say most of, the beginning of the book of Numbers, I think up to chapter 9, it's called the Ark of the Testimony. Then after that, after the presence of the Lord inhabits the tabernacle, after that it's called the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Because at that point the covenant is ratified. And then throughout the rest of the Pentateuch, it's the Ark of the Covenant consistently after that. And we see that transition happen right in the middle of the book of Numbers. So we do see that there is actually a chronological progression as you go through the Pentateuch.
So is it reasonable to believe? Oh, sorry. Keep going.
Well, I just lost that thought, so it's gone.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, sorry about that. Is it reasonable to believe, because I have another person who just asked a question, is it reasonable to believe that, say, Moses wrote most of the Pentateuch, and then maybe the little bits where somebody added in about Moses' death could have been written maybe by Aaron or someone else who was a contemporary of Moses? Is that a reasonable belief? Sure.
That's a reasonable belief. It's also a reason, several beliefs here are actually quite reasonable. Okay, that doesn't have to be the only alternative either, though. It can also be that, we have just a collection of papers that then get collated 150, 200 years later, stitched together into a cohesive narrative. That's also reasonable and would do absolutely nothing to deny anyone's faith. So I think we have to be a little open-minded about this. But at the same time, too, there's reasonable alternatives to, say, the documentary hypothesis. In fact, scholarship in Europe has pretty much abandoned the whole idea.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah. Some of this came out of the work, ironically, out of the work of the biblical minimalist by the name of Van Seters. Van Seters is famous for biblical minimalism, but he's also well known for stabbing a knife to the heart of the documentary hypothesis, which is that he denied the existence of the E source and made, say, the J source later. So him, Schmidt, Rensdorf, and even today, scholars like Kilcore take more of a either a supplementary or a redaction hypothesis when they look at, say, the Pentateuch, but they don't subscribe to the documentary hypothesis anymore. It's pretty much mostly a North American phenomenon these days.
Interesting. Yeah, so we'll have to catch up. It seems like the Brits, they're always leading us in things, and the Germans, it seems like.
Well, the Brits honestly are still a little behind on this, but it's the Germans and the French and the Italians that are really sort of driving this process now.
Interesting. Yeah, because the Germans started it, so they needed to need to fix it. Came from their schools. So listen, we've gone about an hour. I just wanted to know, is there anything else you'd like to chat about today or would like to share with our lovely audience?
Nothing. I have nothing on the schedule.
I wanted to make sure that everybody goes to this. Now, I just bought your book on Amazon. It's called Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context, and you wrote it last December. I think that's what I saw in there. And so I just bought it, and I hope that you guys will all go and buy his book and go to his channel, subscribe. Be sure to subscribe. He's got a really good bunch of videos. In fact, I didn't even get to ask you. Let me just ask you about these popcorn videos. So what I think a lot of people are watching your channel because you're able to go in and dissect other people's channels or opinions very well and very clearly. And so I wanted to know if you have any upcoming plans for popcorn videos.
We are going to be doing more popcorn videos. People love the popcorn videos. We just finished one last week's was on Ron Wyatt and some of his idiot theories on how the pyramids were built. But people do like the popcorn videos. And it just happened by accident, really. He's now a good friend, but at the time, I didn't know him. But Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy, did this video on much hyped the Exodus, which was called the Exodus Rediscovered. And
I saw it.
A lot of my subscribers came up to me and go, "Wow, this is really troubling to me. You got to respond to this." It's like, oh, okay. So I mean, I was at work. I had spent a long, hard day in Vancouver, in downtown Vancouver, for my job, and I was tired. I came home, and it's like, okay, I got to get this done. So I hadn't had anything to eat, so I made myself a bowl of popcorn. Just made a bowl of popcorn. And then I just watched the video, and that was the first time I saw it. So, and that sort of launched, I wouldn't say it wasn't the start of our channel, but it certainly pushed us over that 1,000 subscriber threshold easily.
Yeah, he wrote a bit because he had a different theory and he was following, and there's all these people who have lots of different theories about the Exodus. And so he took his video down, which is,
yes, he did.
I mean, he probably spent hours making that video.
Oh, he spent a long time and a lot of money making that video. He admits that it was a really, really difficult decision for him to pull it down. But, he also had the integrity to say, if I expect my subscribers to follow the data, then I have to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So it showed great personal integrity for him to do that. But I also understand that it was a painful decision to make. Because, you put your blood, sweat, and tears into these, and his production values are off the chart.
Oh, they are.
His production values are off the chart. I'd love to be able to do videos like he does. But I'm not a talented cinematographer or a video editor. So
not either.
For me, I sort of stumble through mine and hope for the best. But and frankly, you know, I did my videos on a shoestring, so my first videos were done
But you
with
have a lot of, it's your own knowledge that you pack in.
Yeah.
You pack in a lot of knowledge, and then you went over
It's
to,
content,
you're also
yeah.
on, you're subscribing to some of the
content.
channels I subscribe to. Content, yes, that's it. You've got good quality content.
It's all about content. Yeah.
It is.
Well, you know, I've got all this education. I should share at least a little bit of it. You know, it's, you know, for the edification of the church. And one of my biggest concerns, and frankly, I've been sort of harder on, say, Christian channels than I am even on the atheists. I know the atheists think I'm being a bully to them, but I'm actually a lot tougher on other Christians because I think the consequences of what they do is more serious. Mm-hmm. Most of the problems we have today, as far as people walking away from the faith, have resulted from really abysmal teaching from the pulpit. You know, sloppy teaching.
Yeah,
sloppy teaching.
This rolls right back to the very beginning of what we pointed out when you said that you and Dr. Josh came from different backgrounds. He came from a young earth creationist, kind of very fundamentalist background, and you came from a more liberal one. And mine is on the more liberal side too. But when you come with this background where they're telling you, you have to believe that dinosaurs lived at the same time as people and all of this kind of stuff. And then you look at the archaeological evidence and you get kind of, why are they teaching me this? Do I have to believe it this way? And then those people tend to become fundamentalist atheists, I noticed. Yeah.
Yes, they do. Well, you know, they'll often try to test, you know, they'll often transition. Like they'll go from, say, full-on fundamentalism to full-on liberalism, but find that they can't wrap their head around the way they think, because leaving fundamentalism is more than just, say, changing your beliefs. It's a mindset. It's a way of thinking. And one is raised to think in a certain way. Like when I was raised, when I grew up, it was like creationism, evolutionism, theistic evolutionism. That's all good. That's how I was raised. That's how I was raised. It's all good.
Yeah, I was too. Just look into it, find out which one's true, and it wasn't really. It never really mattered to me. Evolution wasn't something I ever even cared about.
But if you're raised a fundamentalist, you're told this is the way you have to believe. Mm-hmm. There's one interpretation for the Bible. You have to follow it. And that creates a mindset that's really, really difficult to break later in life. Because when I engage atheists, it's along the lines of, okay, well, how are you reading the Bible? And you get these sort of one interpretation polemics that come through atheistic apologetics. You know, it's a one interpretation method of reading the Bible, even after they've left the faith. Mm-hmm. So most of them will transition shortly through liberal Christianity. They're not picking up the mindset. Mm-mm. The mindset doesn't change, even if the beliefs do.
Yeah, well, that's the, just to piggyback on what you're saying a little bit, is I find that those are the same people who insist that there are these contradictions in the Bible, and they'll take something like, they'll say, oh, there's two accounts of when Judas Iscariot died. Either he fell or he hung himself. And I'm like, why is there not, he hung himself, then he fell headlong? You know, there's all kinds of.
Why can't it be both?
Yeah. Like,
or the two or the three. Or the two or the one thief on the cross versus the two. There's that as well. Like, well, if you have two, you also have one.
Same thing with the angels at the tomb. The same exact thing. Well, how come it never says there was only one angel at the tomb?
Yeah, it doesn't say that.
Angel. Now, if it said it, there's only one. That's different.
Well, then you would have a problem. Yeah, but it doesn't say that.
Exactly, which is what is so crazy.
It's reading into the text. Like, for example, you know, I heard a atheist ironically an Egyptologist, say once that, well, we have no evidence of the Israelites worshiping Yahweh in Egypt. Well, of course not. Of course not. They weren't Israelites yet. They don't become Israelites until the Exodus. And they're worshiping pagan gods in Egypt. Moses brings Yahweh back with him from Midian. In Egypt, they're worshiping Baal and Yahweh, or sorry, not Yahweh, Astarte and Resheph and the Egyptian gods. That's what they're worshiping in Egypt. They're not worshiping Yahweh in Egypt. The Bible never claims it. The Bible never claims it.
I think it's fascinating too that what they do. I mean, I just think it's fascinating when I was looking at how the ancient worlds work, and they kind of work like my son's Minecraft games, where people are going around constantly plundering other groups of people to take all of their wealth. And one of the main ways that they would take the people with them, so they wouldn't just take their wealth; they'd grab the people and bring them with them back to their lands. And the thing that they also did was they go into the temples and grab their statues of gods as if they took their god out of the temple and back with them. And people would be completely upset. Oh my gosh, he's got our god Marduk.
Oh yeah, that happened frequently. Well, that's what happened during the Philistine war with Saul, where Saul dies, and they steal the Ark of the Covenant. You know, Philistines think they're stealing the Israelite god, and they open up the Ark and they find that there's nothing in it but the tablets. Where's the God?
Did they die?
It's missing. Well, they didn't. Some of them died, but most of them didn't. It wasn't until that ark goes to Beit Shemesh, you know, where the Israelites look inside, they get killed. And it comes down to this: who knew better? The Israelites knew better. They knew they weren't supposed to. They were supposed to leave this thing alone. You know, don't look inside of it. Don't defile the holy space. The Philistines did know better, so they were just struck with tumors and sores, and a few of them were killed, but not many. Not in comparison to the Israelites.
It's interesting.
It is interesting.
Where do you think the ark is now? Do you think it's buried by Jeremiah in the side of some mountain?
No. My answer on this really disappoints a lot of people. I think it was taken by Nebuchadnezzar and melted for gold to pay his soldiers. Because this is the Babylonians paid their soldiers in weighed metals, so they were always cash strapped. This is why they built the big furnaces. You know, the furnace that they attempted the execution of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That furnace was created to destroy, to melt, essentially burn and melt down large religious items that they plundered from other countries. They basically take the whole piece of religious furniture, stick it in the furnace, melt it down, and sweep up the gold that was recovered.
It's my understanding too that the bronze from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, the iron required much more burning, a much higher level of heat, and so maybe the big furnaces help for that too, to melt down. Well,
you didn't need that to smelt iron. Okay, you didn't need something that size to smelt iron. That's the furnace that size is particularly suited for destruction of religious furniture. Okay. And we do find this sort of method of gold recovery happen all over the ancient Near East. We find it, for example, inside the pyramid of Senwosret II, where a big bonfire was set in the pyramid to essentially melt all the items that were inside of it and then sweep up the remains. So we do find this used in other contexts. Now, in the case of smelting, what you need for iron smelting is you need... you don't necessarily need a large furnace. What you do need is bellows to force air in to create a reduction in fire, a reduction in flame, reducing flame.
Interesting. Yeah, and it is interesting too that they were collecting lions back then and doing some just very different things than how we live today. So
yeah.
So good. So did you want to share anything that's coming up on your channel or anything like that? We'll let you as we come to a close here.
Well, I don't have anything specific to share. We are working on a lot of new projects. We are still hoping to do more publications and books, but as time permits. One of the things I've discovered having a YouTube channel is how ultimately time-consuming it is. Mm-hmm. So, but I do want to do a book on the 10 plagues of Egypt from an Egyptian perspective, to try to sort of get that information more fleshed out and out there into the general public. So that's one of the projects we want to work on.
Yeah, because it's.
Well, you bought my last book.
I did. I bought your last book. I'll buy that one too, because I'm very interested in that kind of topic. Because I've heard that the 10 plagues each represent one of Egypt's gods.
Yeah, that I don't buy that for a moment. I don't buy that for a moment. That's a view that was, for example, popularized by Curid. And a lot of Christians repeat that. I think that's completely false. If you look at, say, just the biblical texts, none of the 9 plagues are ascribed to the punishment of a god. The only plague that's ascribed to a punishment of, say, the gods of Egypt is the 10th. Now, this is one of the things I think is really interesting about the 10th plague, too, is that it attacks the firstborn. Now, the firstborn being the heir designate. This is not children. This is not infanticide. Okay, this is attacking the inheritance structure of Egypt, essentially the infrastructure, who holds the power. Mm-hmm. Your posterity. That's what's being attacked here. So even in this particular case, the gods of Egypt is not talking about a religious a judgment of, say, the idols in the temple. It's not talking about that. It's talking about anyone who holds the power of life and death. So anything from your military men to your to the royalty to the priests in the temple, basically these people who hold the power of life and death, who have the power and the infrastructure, it's the judgment on them by cutting off their posterity. Who's going to inherit the next thing? And many of these people already held really, really important positions. Like, for example, with the death of Amenhotep Kopshef, Crown Prince. He wasn't just Crown Prince. He was the chief diplomat of Egypt. The death of the firstborn turned the whole system on its head. Basically, it's the equivalent of getting punch drunk. You get hit in the head and you wobble around. You stagger around not knowing what happened. That's what's going on with the 10th plague. It confuses the Egyptians enough where they drive out the people of Israel.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I will definitely take a look at that book. And so you guys make sure you go and you like and subscribe and follow Dr. Falk. He's also can be found on Twitter. He can be found on Facebook. He can be found in a lot of different places online. And of course,
the thing with following me on Facebook is I get a lot of scammers on there try to so I don't always accept friend requests on Facebook. But definitely my channel, Ancient Egypt and the Bible, is people who subscribe to us. That really helps us. And we are just going to try to continue forward doing the work of the kingdom.
I think that's great. And you're coming out with another video with Inspiring Philosophy, right?
Yeah, I'm working with Inspiring Philosophy on his Exodus Rediscovered Revised. So he's decided to break it down into 3 videos. And I am his fact checker for his first one on the Exodus. So I've got that script in my hands right now. I'm doing the editing of it right now, and pointing out, hey, here's some extra information that I think will really benefit your video. Ooh,
I'm looking forward to that. That'll be fun. So yeah, Inspiring Philosophy. He's been on my channel before. He's a great guy, Michael Jones, and he does a great job debating. And so
we're good friends now.
Yeah,
we're good friends now. So and I really appreciate the videos he does do. His one on Joseph is actually pretty good. I actually liked his video on Joseph. He got it right. He got that one right. So
good. I'll have to go listen to that. I don't know if I have, but you're also good friends with Sentinel Apologetics, Rob Rowe, and so that's another.
Oh yes,
I'm pretty sure that's how I found you. It's through Rob Rowe, because he said you've been on his channel too, and actually you guys did a review of another channel. Was it Myth Vision?
It was what was it? Tang, the Atheist
Tang.
Network group.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
Basically, Tang had done a review of my popcorn review of Digital Hammurabi.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And their review was a complete dumpster fire. I mean, it was a complete dumpster fire. It was embarrassing. But we did our counter review at the same time as they were doing theirs. So right at the same time as they were broadcasting, we were on the Rob's channel talking about it, having a great time.
That was fun. I know it was fun to see that. That was, and then I think the guy from Tang called up to Rob's channel because he wanted to get in there.
Yep, and couldn't string two coherent thoughts together.
That was too much. Yeah, I look forward to that, and so I'm definitely going to be. In fact, when you did your last popcorn video, I was very just dying to know who you were doing it on. And Susan here in the chat says that you don't tell anybody in advance.
I don't ever tell nobody in it ever knows who the popcorn is directed to. The popcorn keeps its secrets.
That is a unique little deal that you do.
It is. Well, it came out of the first one too, which was we just there was no announcements for the first popcorn review. We just stuck it out there on a Thursday. It wasn't even on our normal release schedule. So we just dropped it on a Thursday when we never ever actually published videos. So it just came out of nowhere. So after that, it's like, you know, I got all these requests for popcorn reviews, and you know, and almost, I mean, I don't actually go look for videos. It almost always comes from user requests. Well, people see
always, you like you were in Holy Kool-Aid's popcorn. You were in one of his videos. Like you just appeared in his video. So somebody probably saw that and they went and contacted you.
They contacted me, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this is appropriate for a popcorn review. So, but we don't tell anybody. We try to give people at least a week's notice that the popcorn review is coming, but we don't tell anybody who it's about, what it's about, until it actually releases. And then when it releases, we change the thumbnail. So
yeah, because I didn't know the last one was going to be quiet. So.
Yeah, nobody did, but that's it. It's always a surprise. It's like that. I think it's a Monty Python skit. You know, from the Inquisition. I wasn't expecting the Inquisition. No one expects the Inquisition.
Put her in
no one expects chair. The popcorn.
The comfy chair. Yes, put her in the comfy chair. I love Monty Python.
No one expects the popcorn. It's always a surprise. We don't ever tell anyone who it is. It's just something that we just, you know, sort of it's kind of a bit of fun that we have with this as well. And that's one of the things too, is we try to make our videos not just informative but entertaining as well. Mm-hmm. And you'll notice this when you read the book too, that there's a lot of humor in the book. In fact, the editors had to sort of rein me back a little on the humor, because I tend to be a little over the top sometimes with my humor. But there is a lot of humor and illustrations in the book that make the reading a bit lighter. However, in the videos, we know that the best education is also entertaining. Mm-hmm. So we always try to include a little humor, or like, for example, I did a video on the Serapis cult. You know, the sort of the myth vision, sort of the mythicist view that Jesus comes from the Egypto-Greek god Serapis. And every so often, because Serapis is essentially a bovine deity, he's a combination of Osiris Apis, Osiris god of the dead, Apis, the cow god, the bovine deity that Osiris supposedly manifests into. Mm-hmm. So every few minutes when it talks about, when we talk about the cow deity, I'll have a picture flash up with a mooing noise.
I like that. No, that is. I mean, it is funny.
It really drives home the point that Serapis is a bovine deity.
Yeah,
he's not Jesus Christ.
Yeah, exactly. That's this time of year.
The Lamb of
coming up with myths.
Yeah, when we talk about Jesus being the Lamb of God, no one thinks he's an actual sheep. Mm-hmm. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor.
This is an actual cow.
But in the case of Serapis, it's an actual cow. A cow that was worshipped in Egypt for thousands of years.
That's the thing, because it's like in India now, the sacred cow, because they believe that you can be reincarnated into other sentient life. And so there's no reason that couldn't be grandma.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's a holy animal. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a holy animal.
So good. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Falk, for coming in here.
My pleasure.
If you don't mind, when I finish reading your book that's arriving tomorrow, maybe in the next few weeks, we can come back on here and chat. Maybe January, actually, because now that I think about it, we've got kind of a crazy bunch of holidays coming up. But maybe January, we can come back and talk about your book.
Okay, I'd love that. I'd absolutely love that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming in here. Is Kiara your wife?
Thank you very much. Yep, Kiara's my wife.
So thank you, Kiara, for coming to the chat. Because I saw the last name Falk, and she seemed like she's pretty knowledgeable about your stuff. So obviously now I know.
Oh, yeah. She's got a higher IQ than I do. She's scary intelligent.
That's good. So you married up.
Yep. Oh yeah, I definitely married up. And we went to graduate school together too. So it was a cool experience going to grad school with my wife.
Yeah, that would be. We have a few couples at my school who also met each other in grad school. So that's
well, we didn't meet in grad school. We didn't meet. We actually met at a science fiction convention.
Oh yeah.
That's where we met.
Science fiction. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
But later in life, when I went back to grad school, she followed. She went also. So it was very cool that while I was earning my master's degrees, so was she.
Very good. Very good.
Her specialty is different, but
yeah, very interesting things for you to talk about.
Well, she does bioethics.
Oh.
Her sort of specialization is transhumanism.
That's interesting, because there's a big. I've had Fuzz Rana on my channel from Reasons to Believe, and he was talking about that transhumanism. He does a little bit on that too. Yeah.
Well, I like to say she studies future people. I study people. I study dead people, long dead people.
Yeah, that's funny. So good. Well, thank you so much. Nice to meet you, Kiara. That must be her in the background. So nice to meet you.
Yep.
And thank you, everybody. You guys, please like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Thank you so much, Dr. Falk.
Thank you.
Hit end.